Meghan had surrendered the daily obligations of royal life, but she had never surrendered every connection to the institution itself. That distinction now became explosive, because if her title still meant something inside Windsor, Catherine's refusal could look deliberate, but if duty determined precedence, Meghan had walked into a completely different hierarchy. What looked like a small break in royal manners was quickly becoming something much more serious. This was no longer just about whether one woman had curtsied to another. It was about what Meghan's position actually meant now. She was still Harry's wife. She was still connected to the monarchy by marriage, history, family, and title. From Meghan's point of view, stepping away from frontline royal duties had not erased that identity. She had left the working structure, not the family itself. And if the palace still used her royal connection when speaking about her place in the wider family, then she could reasonably ask why that connection seemed to weaken whenever questions of recognition appeared. Catherine saw the issue differently. Her position carried a harsher logic. Royal status, in her view, could not be separated forever from royal responsibility. Titles mattered, but service gave them meaning. Duty gave them weight. And once Harry and Meghan chose a life outside the working monarchy, the institution was forced to redefine the line between those who represented the crown and those who remained connected to it privately. That was why Catherine's refusal mattered. It was not simply a personal coldness. It was a boundary. She could still acknowledge Meghan as family, still speak to her, still treat her with basic dignity, but she was no longer willing to act as though nothing had changed since the Sussexes stepped back. For Harry, that distinction was brutal. If Catherine was right, then leaving royal duty had changed far more than schedules, appearances, and responsibilities. It had changed where he and Meghan stood inside the very family they had never fully stopped belonging to. Meghan saw the contradiction immediately. The palace could not, in her mind, treat her title as meaningful when it suited the institution and then act as though it carried no weight when respect became uncomfortable. That was the pressure point. And William knew it. Yet, he remained silent. Because Catherine's position protected a future structure he would one day inherit. Charles, however, looked trapped between two worlds. As king, he needed consistency. As a father, every rule applied to Harry carried an emotional cost. And before he could settle that conflict, another figure was about to shift the balance completely. Anne had spent decades living by an older royal contract. Rank created visibility. Duty created legitimacy. She understood hierarchy not as decoration, but as obligation. But Catherine had not created that philosophy. And Meghan knew it. The deeper principle belonged to a much older generation of royals, and when Anne finally stepped closer, Harry understood that the argument was about to move beyond two women and become a judgment on the Sussex exit itself. Anne did not need to raise her voice. She had spent a lifetime watching royal popularity rise and collapse while duty continued regardless. And when the conversation turned toward what Meghan was still entitled to receive, Anne reportedly reduced the entire dispute to one brutal principle: recognition followed responsibility. That principle landed harder because Anne was not stepping forward to rescue Catherine from an awkward moment. She was defending something larger. In her mind, the monarchy could only survive if its privileges remained tied to the burdens that came with them. Titles created attention, but service gave those titles meaning. And few people inside the family could make that argument with more authority than Anne. She had spent decades carrying out duties without demanding constant praise, without turning every sacrifice into a public grievance, and without expecting the institution to bend around her personal comfort. That made her difficult for either Harry or Meghan to dismiss. Anne's position was not that Meghan deserved embarrassment. It was far colder than that. If someone voluntarily stepped away from the responsibilities attached to royal life, then the ceremonial advantages could not remain completely untouched. To Anne, that was not punishment. It was consequence. Meghan resisted because she saw danger in that logic. The monarchy created the rules, interpreted the rules, and then decided who had respected them. From her perspective, that gave the institution enormous power to redefine someone standing after the fact. She did not believe sacrifice automatically created moral superiority, especially when many of those sacrifices came from a system people were born into rather than freely choosing. Harry felt the argument cutting much deeper. Anne's words sounded painfully familiar. Duty first. Feelings later. Endure the pressure, because the institution must survive. Those were the same expectations he had grown up under, and the same expectations he later believed had cost him emotionally. Catherine stayed silent. That mattered. She did not need to defend herself because Anne was explaining the principle behind her refusal. William, meanwhile, watched Harry rather than Meghan. The real fracture was still between the brothers, because each now represented a completely different answer to the same question. How much should a person surrender to remain inside the royal structure? Anne's example made Catherine's future impossible to ignore. Catherine had accepted restrictions for years because her position beside William demanded them. Meghan believed questioning those restrictions was equally legitimate. And suddenly, both sides carried emotional weight. Charles understood the danger. Another private compromise would not solve this. Whatever he allowed now could shape every future encounter. Then came the deeper suspicion. Catherine's refusal may not have been spontaneous at all. William and Catherine had already discussed how future meetings with the Sussexes should be handled. That possibility changed everything. If Catherine had entered Windsor already knowing where she intended to draw the line, then the missing Curtsey was not a momentary reaction at all, and Meghan suddenly wanted to know whether William had helped decide what would happen before she even entered the room. William understood something Harry did not want to hear. One day Charles would no longer be standing between them. Every unresolved question about titles, access, ceremonies, and precedence would eventually become William's responsibility, and he had no intention of inheriting a family conflict without deciding where its boundaries began. That was why, for William, the argument had never truly been about a single Curtsey. The danger was the uncertainty surrounding it. Every unclear rule created another future confrontation. Every exception could become an expectation. And William believed Charles had spent years trying to preserve his relationship with Harry by leaving certain questions deliberately unsettled. As a father, that instinct made sense. As a future king, William saw something more dangerous. The monarchy could not keep depending on personal flexibility whenever family emotions collided with royal structure. Catherine's position made that reality impossible to ignore. She was moving steadily closer to the center of the institution beside William, and her responsibilities would only grow. She could not behave forever as though nothing had changed since Harry and Meghan stepped away. That transformed her refusal into something colder than resentment. It became a decision about the future. Harry pushed back immediately. Family, he believed, could not be divided into neat categories of working and non-working, official and private, useful and excluded. Blood did not disappear because a role changed. But William's answer carried its own uncomfortable force. Harry had wanted greater separation between private life and public royal duty. He could not now demand that those boundaries disappear whenever they produced consequences he disliked. Meghan understood the trap almost at once. If she insisted too strongly that Catherine owed her ceremonial recognition, critics could accuse her of still wanting the privileges of royal life. But if she said the gesture meant nothing, Then why had Catherine's refusal caused such tension? The argument had become psychological. The curtsey itself was almost secondary. That was when Catherine finally made the distinction Harry feared most. She could recognize Meghan warmly as part of the family without pretending their ceremonial positions remained exactly as they had once been. Family connection and royal order were no longer automatically the same thing. For Harry, that idea cut deep. It suggested that he and Meghan could remain connected to the monarchy forever while standing increasingly outside the structure that once defined their lives. Charles now understood William's earlier silence. His eldest son had not been avoiding the confrontation. He believed it was overdue. And instead of smoothing everything over, Charles suddenly asked Meghan the question nobody had yet put so directly. What, exactly, did she expect when she returned to royal spaces? For the first time, Meghan was no longer being asked what the palace had done to her. She was being asked what she expected from the palace now, and as she answered Charles, the king began to understand that the Curtsey dispute was hiding a far more dangerous disagreement about belonging. Meghan's answer reportedly surprised them because she did not demand a crown, a position, or a return to royal duty. She demanded consistency. If the family still introduced her through the identity she gained by marrying Harry, she argued, then that identity could not suddenly disappear whenever royal recognition became inconvenient. For Meghan, this was no longer about ambition, it was about dignity. She believed the palace could not keep Harry and Meghan connected to the monarchy whenever that connection attracted attention, history, or public interest, then quietly weaken that same connection when questions of respect became uncomfortable. To her, Catherine's refusal exposed the contradiction completely. The Sussexes seemed trapped in a strange middle ground, royal enough to be judged by royal standards, royal enough to have every decision examined, yet somehow not royal enough to know exactly where they stood. Harry understood that frustration immediately, because he had felt it since leaving. He could step away from duties, but he could not step away from being Charles' son, William's brother, Diana's child, or a man whose entire identity had been shaped by the crown. That was why Meghan's argument struck something personal in him. The institution could reduce their official role, but it could not simply erase the history that continued to define them. Catherine, however, refused to accept that the confusion had been created by the palace alone. Harry and Meghan had wanted freedom from the institution, while still remaining connected to an identity that existed because of it. That, she believed, was where the uncertainty began. Anne was even firmer. Freedom from duty, in her view, naturally created distance from ceremonial privilege. It did not mean humiliation. It meant consequence. Charles said nothing. And that silence became heavier with every second, because everyone knew his answer would reach far beyond one Windsor gathering. Harry was not merely a former working royal. He was Charles's son. Yet if Charles protected him from every uncomfortable consequence, what message would that send to Anne, William, Catherine, Sophie, and everyone who had remained inside the system? Then, Meghan pushed further. She asked whether Catherine would have acted the same way if Elizabeth were still alive. The question changed everything. Elizabeth was no longer simply a former monarch in that argument. She became the standard against which every idea of service, loyalty, and royal behavior was suddenly being measured. Catherine refused to be pulled into a comparison. She would not claim to know what Elizabeth might have expected. But she made one thing clear. She would not perform a ceremonial gesture simply to hide a disagreement everyone already knew existed. And Charles finally understood there was no painless compromise left. He could soften Catherine's position and protect Harry and Meghan emotionally. Or he could support a boundary that might reshape every future Sussex visit. Charles had spent years delaying precisely that choice, hoping time would somehow separate the father from the monarch. Windsor gave him nowhere left to hide, and when he finally turned toward Catherine, even William could not immediately tell which Charles was about to speak. Charles did not order Catherine to curtsy. He did not demand an apology from Meghan either. What he reportedly did was far more consequential. With one carefully controlled response, the king ended the ambiguity that had allowed family affection and royal status to remain blurred for years. Charles made one thing clear first: nobody in the family should be deliberately humiliated. That mattered, because it stopped the moment from becoming a public victory for Catherine or a punishment for Meghan. But then came the part that changed everything. He would not force Catherine to perform a ceremonial gesture simply to make the room feel comfortable again. In Charles's view, the monarchy could not keep adjusting its rules depending on who was present, who felt offended, or which family relationship needed protecting that day. Consistency had to mean something. That was when the room reportedly went silent. For years, Charles had been seen as the person most likely to preserve some emotional route back for Harry. Whatever the arguments, whatever the interviews, whatever the distance, Harry was still his son. That was why his refusal to soften the moment carried such weight. Harry heard it as proof that the institution would always come first in the end. To him, this was not simply about Catherine. It was another example of the crown winning whenever family and duty collided. Charles pushed back against that idea. Loving Harry as a son, he made clear, did not mean treating every situation involving Harry as an exception. That distinction was painful, but it was also final. Meghan understood the deeper meaning almost immediately. Charles was accepting that future royal gatherings could happen without recreating the Sussexes' former position. Their family connection might remain, but the old ceremonial assumptions would not automatically return with them. Catherine did not celebrate. That silence strengthened her position. She had not refused the curtsy to humiliate Meghan. She had drawn a boundary and allowed Charles to decide whether that boundary could stand. William understood what had just happened. A precedent had been created. Institutionally, it might make his own future easier because fewer questions would remain unresolved. Personally, it could make reconciliation with Harry even harder. Anne barely reacted. Charles had simply stated the principle she had represented all along. And that was what made his authority so powerful. He did not explode. He did not threaten. Visible disappointment replaced rage. Finality replaced argument. Still, Charles refused to let anyone suggest Harry no longer belonged to the family. He remained a son, a brother, an uncle. But belonging to the family no longer guaranteed the same ceremonial place inside the monarchy. Meghan finally saw it clearly. Catherine's missing curtsy had only lit the fuse. Charles' decision was the real explosion. But there was one detail Charles could not control: Harry's reaction. Because to the king, the distinction between family and monarchy created a path forward, but to Harry, it sounded painfully similar to being told he could come home only if he accepted that home had changed without him. Harry had spent years insisting that titles and protocol were never the heart of his conflict. Yet standing inside Windsor, he suddenly understood why one missing curtsy hurt so deeply. It was not the gesture itself. It was the realization that his old position could disappear while every memory attached to it remained. For Harry, Windsor was never just a royal residence. It carried too much history. Childhood, Diana, Elizabeth, military ceremonies, weddings, funerals, duty, anger, privilege, loss, all of it existed together, impossible to separate. That was why Charles' decision cut deeper than a formal ruling. Harry understood Catherine's logic because he had lived inside the same system long enough to know why precedence mattered. He knew how carefully hierarchy was protected. He knew that every gesture could carry meaning. But accepting that logic also meant accepting something painful. Leaving royal duty had created consequences that could not always be renegotiated whenever he returned. Meghan saw the change in him. Her focus began shifting away from Catherine personally, and toward what this moment meant for the future. If every visit could become another test of rank, respect, and belonging, then returning to royal spaces would never be simple again. William faced his own cost. Clear boundaries might protect the monarchy he would one day inherit, but they could also push his brother farther away. Every rule William defended strengthened the institution while weakening something personal between them. That was the tragedy neither brother could escape. Catherine now occupied the most difficult position of all. Her future rank meant these questions would only become sharper. If William eventually became king, her own place would change again, and Harry and Meghan could not avoid ceremonial hierarchy forever if they continued attending major royal occasions. Anne understood that too. She represented continuity without sentimentality, but even she knew rules had human consequences. And Charles felt those consequences most painfully. He had defended consistency, yet he now faced the possibility that winning the institutional argument had cost him another piece of Harry. Meghan began wondering whether future appearances were worth it at all. Harry, meanwhile, faced an even darker question. Did returning mean accepting the very structure he had once believed distance would free him from? Yet one issue remained unresolved. Catherine had still not explained whether her refusal belonged only to this one encounter, or whether it revealed how she intended to treat Meghan from now on. That answer could matter at the next wedding, funeral, christening, coronation, or gathering where the same family found itself under the same roof. And that was why nobody left Windsor believing the argument was finished. Charles had clarified the rule, Harry had felt its cost, and Meghan had discovered the new reality, but Catherine still held the one answer that would determine whether this had been a single refusal or the beginning of something permanent. The final revelation was not that Catherine wanted Meghan embarrassed. It was almost the opposite. Catherine refused, because pretending the old hierarchy still existed would only delay a confrontation guaranteed to return later, and with William moving closer to the throne, she believed the family could no longer survive by avoiding uncomfortable truths. That was what made the moment so important. Catherine's refusal forced Charles to confront the exact issue he had repeatedly tried to keep flexible. For years, family affection and royal structure had existed side by side, blurred enough to avoid a final reckoning. But Catherine believed that uncertainty could not continue forever. Every step William took toward kingship changed her responsibilities too. And with that came a harder question. How could the future monarchy function if nobody was willing to admit that Harry and Meghan's position had changed? For Catherine, clarity was not punishment. It was protection against a larger conflict later. Meghan saw the issue from another direction. To her, dignity could not mean surrendering personal freedom or accepting every inherited tradition without question. She had already challenged the idea that royal duty should automatically outrank emotional well-being, and she was not prepared to accept that stepping away meant every old form of respect should disappear with it. That was why neither woman fit neatly into the role of hero or villain. Catherine represented continuity. Meghan represented resistance. Both believed they were protecting something important, but their definitions of respect could coexist privately and still collide the moment ceremony entered the room. Charles' response became the real turning point. he had made clear that family closeness would not automatically restore the old hierarchy. Yet even after drawing that line, he could not reduce Harry to the status of an ordinary former working royal. Too much remained between them: grief, fatherhood, resentment, love, and years of unfinished reconciliation. William understood why the boundary had to be drawn now. Delay it, and one day he would inherit the same conflict under even greater pressure. Anne represented the older contract: service first, emotion second, recognition never guaranteed. Catherine represented where that contract was heading next, because her place would only become more central as William's responsibilities grew. Meghan eventually chose not to push Catherine further inside Windsor. But by then, the damage had already been done. Everyone understood the refusal had been intentional. Now the larger question remained. Could Meghan return to royal spaces under those changed conditions, or would every future appearance demand compromises she no longer wished to make? Harry remained trapped between two worlds. Charles had protected the crown, but he had not healed his family, and somewhere ahead waited another gathering, another test, and another moment when nobody could pretend the rules were unclear. Because the next time Catherine and Meghan enter the same royal room, nobody will be waiting to discover whether the old rules still apply. They will already know Charles's answer, and the only question capable of silencing the room again will be whether either woman is prepared to bend.